It was a scorching afternoon in the vast desert of the American Southwest. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting long shadows across the arid land. Hank McAllister, a rugged cowboy in his mid-30s, rode along the dusty trail on his trusty horse, Dusty. His weathered face was a map of hard years spent under the unforgiving sun. He had worked cattle, repaired fences, and survived on this land for more years than he cared to count. The life of a cowboy was solitary, but Hank preferred it that way. He didn't mind the quiet. It suited him. Hank had grown used to the vastness of the desert. He knew its every twist and turn, every little dry creek bed, every rocky outcrop. But today, as his horse's hooves clopped over the dry earth, something unusual caught his eye. A figure, a small one, moved slowly in the distance, barely visible against the horizon. At first, Hank thought it was just a mirage, the heat playing tricks on his eyes. But as he got closer, he realized that the figure was very real. It was a young girl. His heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for a child to be out here alone. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and anyone who traveled through it without the proper skills would never make it far. Hank urged Dusty into a steady gallop, his boots clicking on the saddle. As he drew closer, he saw the girl more clearly. She was thin, dressed in worn clothes, and her hair was tangled, as if she had been out there for days without shelter. The girl, perhaps 12 or 13, looked up when she heard the sound of Dusty's hooves. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she stumbled back, her hands raised as if to shield herself. Hank slowed his horse, his eyes softening with concern. "Hey now," Hank said, his voice gentle. "You all right, girl?" The girl didn't respond right away, but Hank noticed she was breathing heavily. She looked scared, lost. She had a wild look in her eyes, the kind of look that comes from being alone in the wilderness for far too long. "I won't hurt you," Hank reassured her. "Where's your family?" The girl hesitated, glancing nervously around as if she feared being followed. Her lips trembled slightly, and it was clear she wasn't sure whether she could trust him. She finally spoke, but her voice was barely a whisper. I got lost. My people. They were attacked. I was separated." Hank's heart sank. It wasn't the first time he had heard of Apache raids in these parts. The Apache people were known for their fierce independence and their deep connection to the land. But there had been conflicts with settlers and the U.S. government for years. Hank wasn't one to judge people based on rumors. He had lived alongside the Apache for years, and he knew that not all stories told about them were true. But he also knew that when trouble came, it came fast, and the desert could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. "Where were they last?" Hank asked, keeping his voice calm. The girl shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know. I was running. They attacked. I ran until I couldn't run anymore." Hank could see the girl's exhaustion. She was on the edge, physically and emotionally spent. He didn't know the full story, but he knew one thing for certain. This girl needed help, and fast. "All right," Hank said, dismounting his horse. "You're coming with me. We'll figure this out. I'll get you somewhere safe." The girl didn't resist as Hank helped her onto Dusty's back. She was too tired to argue, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. She clung to Hank's back as Dusty moved smoothly across the desert, his hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. As they rode, Hank kept glancing over at the girl. She had dark eyes full of sadness but also strength. There was something in her that told Hank she had seen far more than any child should. Her face, though soft, showed the resilience of someone who had been forced to survive when the world seemed to turn its back. Hank could only wonder what kind of life she had known before the attack. The ride was slow, but Hank was in no rush. He knew the land well, and he guided Dusty along a path that would lead them back to his small ranch. It wasn't much, just a modest piece of land with a few cattle and a small cabin. But it was a place where a person could rest, heal, and think things through. Hank had lived alone for years, and though he wasn't used to having anyone else around, he had the feeling that this girl, this lost soul, wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. It took them nearly an hour to reach the ranch. As they approached, Hank noticed his dog, Buck, wagging his tail near the cabin. He was a big, scruffy mutt that Hank had found as a pup years ago, and he was always a good companion. Buck barked and ran to greet them, but Hank called him off. The girl, who had been quiet the entire ride, looked around at the ranch with curiosity. She had never seen a place like this, with its simple wooden fences and the dusty fields stretching out beyond. Hank dismounted and helped her down from the horse. She seemed hesitant, but he gave her a reassuring smile. "This is my place," Hank said. "You can rest here for as long as you need." The girl didn't say anything at first, but Hank could see the gratitude in her eyes. She didn't know who he was or where she was, but for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she felt safe. Hank led her into the cabin, which was modest but comfortable. There was a small fire burning in the stove and a simple bed in the corner. The girl looked at the bed, then back at Hank. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. Hank smiled softly. "It's nothing. You're safe now." He set about getting her some water and food, trying to make her as comfortable as he could. He knew it was going to take time for her to heal, both physically and emotionally. But Hank had seen a lot of hardship in his time, and he knew that sometimes all it took was a little kindness to begin the healing process. As he sat down across from her, watching her take small bites of the bread and drink the water, Hank felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for now, he was determined to keep this girl safe, and maybe, just maybe, he would learn more about her and about himself along the way. But one thing was certain: their journey together was only just beginning. The days following Kaya's arrival at Hank McAllister's ranch were filled with quiet routine. Life on the ranch was simple and steady. Hank woke up early every morning, feeding the cattle and checking the fences. There was always something to do: fixing broken gates, mending the roof of the small cabin, or tending to the vegetable garden in the back. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Hank had learned to make do with what he had, and he was used to being alone. Kaya, on the other hand, had never known such calm. She had been raised in the wilds of the desert, surrounded by her people, the Apache, and their ways of survival. The pace of life here on Hank's ranch was slow and unfamiliar. At first, she barely spoke. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, looking out at the vast, empty land. It was clear that she was thinking of something, someone far away. Sometimes Hank would catch a glimpse of sadness in her eyes, but she never spoke of what had happened to her family. Each day, Hank would try to include Kaya in the work. He wasn't sure how to make her feel at home, but he knew that giving her something to do might help her feel less alone. So he started by showing her how to care for the animals. He would ask her to help feed the chickens, water the horses, and bring the cows into the barn when it was time. Kaya, though still quiet, began to follow Hank's lead, learning quickly how to care for the land and animals. She was a natural, her hands steady as she worked, her movements graceful and efficient. Over time, Kaya began to open up, though not with words. She showed Hank her skills: how she could track animals through the desert, how she could recognize the signs of a storm long before it arrived, and how she could navigate the harsh terrain with ease. Hank was amazed at how quickly she adapted to life on the ranch. Despite having been lost in the desert for so long, one afternoon, Hank was repairing a fence along the western side of the property when he noticed Kaya standing near the barn, watching him closely. She had a look on her face that Hank recognized. It was the same look she had when she first arrived, a mixture of sadness and strength, as though she were carrying a burden too heavy to share. "Everything all right?" Hank called out to her, wiping sweat from his brow. Kaya didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, her arms crossed over her chest. Hank could tell she was thinking about something, perhaps about her past, about the family she had lost. He had learned not to push her too hard. She would talk when she was ready. Kaya finally walked over to him, her boots crunching in the dry grass. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the ground. "I used to be able to track the deer," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I know where they go, where they hide." Hank was surprised by the suddenness of her words. He had never heard her speak of her past in such a way before. "You're a good tracker," Hank said with a nod. "I've seen how you watch the land. You know it better than most people." Kaya looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I learned from my mother. She taught me." The mention of her mother made Hank pause. He had wondered about Kaya's family, about who she had been before the attack, but he knew that some things were too painful to ask. He didn't press her further, but simply nodded. "Well," Hank said, his voice gentle, "if you ever feel like tracking those deer again, I could use your help. We need to bring in some food for the winter. You've got skills, and I've got a place to fill." For the first time in days, Kaya gave him a small smile, her lips curling at the corners. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe I will." Over the next few days, Kaya's presence on the ranch became more and more a part of the daily rhythm. She would join Hank in the mornings to gather firewood, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch watching the sun set over the desert. Though they never spoke much, a quiet understanding began to form between them. Kaya, in her own way, had come to see Hank as someone she could rely on, someone who had given her shelter and safety when the world seemed to have turned its back on her. But Hank knew that Kaya wasn't just any ordinary girl. She had lived through things that no child should have to experience. Her mother, her people, he didn't know what had happened to them, but he could see the pain in Kaya's eyes when she thought no one was looking. He wanted to ask her more, to understand what had happened, but he also knew that some wounds ran too deep to be healed by mere words. One morning, as the cold of winter began to creep into the air, Hank woke up early to find Kaya already outside, her breath visible in the chill. She was standing by the small barn, looking out across the land. Hank approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but he couldn't help but notice how at peace she seemed in the quiet of the morning. "You're up early," Hank said, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked over to her. Kaya didn't turn to face him, but she spoke softly, her words almost lost in the wind. "I like the quiet." Hank stood beside her, following her gaze. The snow-covered land stretched out in front of them, peaceful and still. It was a sight that always made Hank feel at home, even though the desert could be a harsh and unforgiving place. He had learned to appreciate the stillness of it, the way the land seemed to breathe in its own time. "I understand," Hank said. "The quiet can help you think." Kaya nodded, though she didn't say anything more. Hank wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he didn't press her. Instead, he stood beside her in silence, the two of them taking in the moment together. As the days passed, Hank found that Kaya's presence on the ranch was becoming more than just a routine. She was starting to fill a space in his life that he hadn't realized was empty. He had never been a man of many words, and neither was she. But there was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding of the land, of survival, and of the quiet ways of life. One evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Hank sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. Kaya came to join him, sitting silently beside him. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was comfortable, familiar. Hank had always preferred the peace of solitude, but now, with Kaya at his side, he found himself appreciating it in a different way. For the first time since she had arrived, Hank began to wonder what the future might hold for them both. He had never planned for a child to come into his life, let alone an Apache girl who had lost everything. But in this quiet place they had found something that felt like home. As the fire flickered low and the desert night stretched out before them, Hank couldn't help but feel that their story together was just beginning. There was much more to Kaya's past than she had shared, and Hank knew that one day she would open up. But for now, they both seemed content to let the silence speak for them, letting the quiet bond of trust grow stronger with each passing day. As the weeks passed, life on the ranch continued to settle into a peaceful routine. Kaya had grown more comfortable with Hank, though she still remained quiet at times, often lost in her thoughts. Hank had grown used to her silence, respecting her space and letting her open up when she was ready. She had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, helping with chores, keeping an eye on the cattle, and even starting to take over the cooking when Hank was busy. But one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Hank had just finished mending a fence on the north side of the property when he saw a small cloud of dust rising in the distance. At first he thought it might be a group of cattle, but as the riders drew closer, he realized they were human. His instincts kicked in and he immediately moved to the barn to grab his rifle just in case. But as the riders came into view, Hank's grip on the rifle loosened. There, riding at the head of the group, was a woman, an Apache woman no older than 35, with long black hair flowing behind her like a dark river. She was dressed in a simple worn dress with a leather shawl draped over her shoulders. The other riders, men and women, followed behind her, but it was the woman who caught Hank's attention. There was something about her, something both familiar and powerful. Her face, though weathered by time and hardship, had a grace to it that Hank could not ignore. The woman rode with confidence, her posture straight and proud, her eyes scanning the land as though she had walked this earth for 1,000 years. When she saw Hank standing by the barn, her eyes met his, and for a moment there was an understanding between them. Hank knew this wasn't just any Apache woman. This was someone important. But before he could react, She and her group had already reached the edge of the property, halting their horses. Hank straightened, lowering his rifle but keeping a cautious eye on the group. He didn't know what this meeting would bring, but he had learned long ago that encounters like this could turn either way. The woman dismounted gracefully and walked toward him, her eyes never leaving his. "You must be Hank McAllister," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. "I am Ayanna. I have come to find my daughter." Hank blinked in surprise. His mind raced. Daughter? Was she talking about Kaya? Before he could speak, Kaya appeared at the door of the cabin. She had been out back gathering wood for the fire, but she must have heard the horses and came to investigate. As she stepped into the sunlight, she froze when she saw Ayanna. The world seemed to stand still for a moment as mother and daughter locked eyes, neither of them speaking, but both of them recognizing something deep within the other. Kaya's face was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, a longing, as if a part of her had been missing and now it had returned. Ayanna took a slow step forward, her gaze softening as she reached out toward Kaya. "You are safe now, my child," she said quietly, her voice filled with relief. "I thought I had lost you forever." Kaya stood motionless, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't move at first, unsure whether to believe the woman standing before her. Ayanna's presence stirred memories. Memories of a life Kaya had left behind, a life she had tried to forget. But as the seconds passed, Kaya's resolve seemed to crumble. She took a hesitant step toward her mother and then, before Hank knew it, she was running toward Ayanna, her arms outstretched. The two embraced, and for the first time in months, Kaya seemed to relax, her body shaking with emotion. Hank stood by, watching the reunion unfold in front of him. A sense of wonder washed over him. He had known that Kaya had been through something terrible. He had seen it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself. But now he understood that she had lost more than just a home. She had lost her family. For a long while, neither Ayanna nor Kaya spoke. They simply held each other, both lost in the feeling of being reunited. Hank, standing awkwardly by the barn, cleared his throat. I didn't know she had a family," Hank said, his voice rough. "She came to me after being separated from her people." Ayanna looked up at him then, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I thank you, Hank McAllister. I know that I owe you much for taking care of her." Her voice was strong, but there was a softness to it that made Hank realize she was not just an Apache warrior. She was a mother, a woman who had suffered the loss of her child and fought to bring her back. "You don't owe me anything," Hank replied, his tone sincere. "She's a tough girl. I just did what needed to be done." Ayanna nodded, understanding the unspoken bond between Hank and Kaya. But then her expression darkened slightly, as if a shadow passed over her thoughts. "I have come to find Kaya," Ayanna said, "but I am also searching for my people. Our tribe was scattered and I fear the worst. We were attacked by soldiers and many of our people are lost. I must find them before it is too late." Hank could hear the pain in Ayanna's voice. It was clear that she had not just been searching for her daughter. She had been searching for her entire world. The Apache had been through so much already, and now they faced the possibility of losing everything. "You'll find them," Hank said quietly. "I know this land. I can help you. If you need me to, I'll ride with you." Ayanna studied him for a moment, and then with a small nod she agreed. "You are a good man, Hank McAllister. I will accept your help." But before they could make any further plans, Kaya stepped back from her mother, her face flushed with emotion. She looked at Ayanna, her voice barely a whisper. "Where were you? Why didn't you come for me sooner?" Kaya asked, the pain in her words undeniable. Ayanna's face softened with sorrow. She took a step toward Kaya, her hand reaching out to touch her daughter's cheek gently. "I have been searching for you, my child. The soldiers took so much from us. I was lost, and I feared you had been lost to me forever." Kaya looked down at the ground, her emotions clearly overwhelmed. Hank, who had been watching the exchange silently, knew that there was much more to their story. He didn't need to understand all the details, but he could see the bond between them, stronger than ever despite the years of separation. "I know it has been hard," Ayanna continued, "but we must look forward now. We must find our people and rebuild what was lost. Together." Kaya nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with sorrow but also a spark of hope. The world had torn them apart, but perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new. Hank, standing in the background, felt a sense of respect for Ayanna. He had seen many struggles in his life, but the strength of this woman, the way she had survived and continued to fight for her family, stirred something deep inside him. This was far from over. The journey ahead would be difficult, but with Ayanna and Kaya reunited, Hank knew that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the desert, Hank felt a quiet sense of peace. The family he had once never expected to have, an Apache girl and her mother, had become his family too. And no matter what came next, he would stand by them. The days following the reunion of Kaya and Ayanna were filled with a mix of emotions: hope, uncertainty, and a sense of loss. Although the two women were finally back together, the weight of their separation for so many months and the destruction of their people still hung heavily in the air. Hank McAllister watched quietly as Kaya and Ayanna tried to adjust to their new reality, one where they were no longer alone but still faced a future filled with uncertainty. As the days passed, Hank could see that both Kaya and Ayanna were struggling with more than just the physical hardships of life on the ranch. There were deeper issues at play, questions of identity, loyalty, and survival. Ayanna had spent years searching for her daughter, and though she had finally found her, the pain of that lost time still lingered in her eyes. She was a warrior, a leader among her people, and her strength had always been her greatest asset. But now, standing on Hank's ranch, she was faced with a different kind of battle. She had to reconcile the woman she had been with the reality of her new life, one that no longer revolved around her tribe and her people. Ayanna had always lived by the ways of the Apache, and now she had to face the fact that the world around her had changed. Kaya, too, was struggling. She had spent so much time alone in the wilderness learning to survive that she wasn't sure where she fit into the world anymore. The bond she had with her mother was undeniable, but there was a distance between them, one that Kaya couldn't explain. She loved Ayanna deeply, but the years of separation had created a divide, one that was not easily bridged. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert, Hank noticed the tension between mother and daughter. Kaya had been out early, as she often was, tending to the animals. When she returned to the cabin, Ayanna was waiting for her, sitting on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon. "You've been gone a long time," Ayanna said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of concern and frustration. "Why do you keep running off by yourself?" Kaya stiffened at her mother's words. She had heard the tone before. Ayanna was not just asking about her whereabouts, but questioning her actions, as if she still didn't fully trust her daughter's ability to make decisions on her own. Kaya had lived so long without anyone to answer to, without anyone telling her what to do, that the idea of being questioned by her mother felt like a burden she wasn't ready to bear. "I'm not running off," Kaya replied, her voice defensive. "I just need space. I can't stay here all the time." Ayanna's eyes softened slightly, but the concern remained. "You can't keep pushing me away, Kaya. We need to be together. We need to heal, and that means being a family again." Kaya looked at her mother for a long moment, but her gaze quickly dropped to the ground. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank, who had been working in the barn nearby, heard the conversation but didn't want to intrude. He had learned to give people their space, especially when emotions were running high. However, he could tell that the struggle between Kaya and Ayanna wasn't just about being apart for so long. It was about what had changed in them during that time. Kaya had been shaped by the wilderness, by the harshness of the land and the loss of her people. She had learned to survive on her own. But Ayanna had been shaped by a different kind of strength, the strength of leadership, of tradition, of guiding her people. Now they both had to find a way to come together, to reconcile the past with the present. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between mother and daughter only seemed to grow. Ayanna wanted to lead, to guide Kaya back into the life of their people, but Kaya resisted. She had spent too much time learning to be independent, too much time fighting to survive on her own to suddenly fit into a world that no longer felt like home. One afternoon, Hank decided it was time for a change. He had been watching from the sidelines, seeing the struggle between Kaya and Ayanna, and he knew that they needed something more than just words. They needed to take action, to do something together that would help them reconnect. He approached Ayanna as she was tending to the horses, her hands moving with a practiced ease as she cared for the animals. "Ayanna," Hank said gently, "maybe it's time to give Kaya some room to find her way back. She's been through a lot. I think she needs to learn to trust herself again before she can trust anyone else." Ayanna paused, her hand resting on the back of a horse. She turned to Hank, her expression thoughtful. "I know she's been through a lot," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "But I can't help her if she won't let me in. I've spent so many years looking for her, and now that I've found her, it feels like I'm losing her all over again." Hank nodded, understanding the depth of Ayanna's pain. "I think you're both struggling with the same thing. She's afraid of losing you again, but she's also afraid of being controlled. You need to show her that you're not trying to take away her independence. You need to help her find her own way, not just the way you want for her." Ayanna looked at Hank, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But Hank's expression was sincere, his words coming from a place of understanding. "I'll try," she said finally, her voice soft. "I'll try to give her space. But it's hard. I just want to protect her." "I know," Hank said, offering a reassuring smile. "But sometimes the best way to protect someone is to let them go a little, to let them make their own decisions. You can't control everything, Ayanna. You have to trust her." That evening, after the sun had set and the stars filled the sky, Hank saw a change. Kaya had come back to the ranch after a long day of work in the fields. She didn't go straight to the cabin as usual, but instead made her way to the barn, where Ayanna was finishing up the evening chores. Hank stood at the door of the cabin, watching as Kaya and Ayanna stood together in the dim light of the barn. They didn't speak at first, but the silence between them felt different this time. It wasn't filled with frustration or tension, but with a quiet understanding. Kaya reached out and touched her mother's arm, her fingers brushing against the worn fabric of Ayanna's sleeve. "I'm sorry," Kaya said softly. "I know you want what's best for me. I just don't know how to be who you want me to be." Ayanna looked at Kaya for a long moment, then nodded. "You don't have to be who I want you to be, Kaya. You just need to be yourself. I just want you to be happy." Kaya's face softened and she nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can be happy, but I'm trying." Ayanna smiled, her hand gently resting on Kaya's shoulder. "That's all I can ask for. Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." The tension between them had begun to lift, replaced by something new: trust. It wasn't going to be easy for either of them, but they had taken the first step. And for the first time in a long while, Hank felt that things might start to heal. As the night grew darker, Hank turned back toward the cabin, giving them space. There was still much to be done, but for now it seemed that the most important thing was giving Kaya and Ayanna the time they needed to rediscover each other. Sometimes healing didn't happen all at once. But with patience, trust, and a little bit of space, they would find their way back to one another. And Hank, though he didn't fully understand their struggle, was willing to stand by them, ready to help however he could. The winter months brought a crisp stillness to the desert, as the earth seemed to pause beneath the weight of the cold. The days were shorter and the nights longer, and Hank McAllister, who had grown accustomed to solitude, found himself adjusting to a new rhythm of life. Kaya and Ayanna had settled into a tentative peace, though it was clear that there were still challenges ahead for both of them. They had taken the time to heal, to talk, and to learn to trust each other once more. But their journey was far from over. The bond between mother and daughter, though stronger than ever, still carried the marks of years spent apart. Ayanna had told Kaya stories of their people, of the Apache ways, of their land, and of the traditions they held dear. Kaya, in turn, had shared the lessons she had learned while wandering the desert alone. It was a slow process, one that required patience, but there was something undeniable about the connection they were rebuilding. One chilly morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Hank sat on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He had come to enjoy these quiet moments, watching the sun rise over the rugged land that he had come to love. It was a land that, in its own way, had shaped him, had taught him lessons of survival, independence, and strength. Now it seemed that the land had become a home for not just Hank, but for Kaya and Ayanna as well. Kaya stepped out onto the porch, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid, and her face illuminated by the early morning light. She had grown more confident over the past few weeks, her quiet strength evident in the way she carried herself. Ayanna followed her, her movements graceful, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Hank had come to understand. She had seen too much, lost too much, and though she had Kaya back, the scars of her past were not easily erased. "Morning," Hank said, offering them both a smile as they joined him on the porch. Cold out today. Kaya nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It's always cold here in the mornings, she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had never fully adjusted to the chill of the desert mornings, but over time, she had come to appreciate the sharp beauty of the land. Ayana, standing a little apart from them, seemed lost in thought. She had been quiet lately, her mind heavy with memories of her people and the journey ahead. Hank knew that she was still grappling with the loss of her tribe. But he also knew that she was determined to rebuild, to find a way to move forward. We should start preparing for the spring, Hank said, breaking the silence. The crops will need to be planted soon, and we'll need to make sure the cattle are ready for the warmer months. Ayana nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. Yes, we must prepare. The land may have been kind to us for now, but we mustn't take it for granted. We have much work to do. Kaya glanced at her mother, a mixture of understanding and uncertainty in her eyes. I know, she said softly. I want to help. I want to do something that matters. Ayana turned to face her daughter, her expression softening. You already are, Kaya. You've shown me strength I never knew you had. You've survived in ways I couldn't even imagine. You've learned to listen to the land, to trust yourself. That is something no one can take from you. Kaya looked down at her hands, her fingers brushing the weathered wood of the porch railing. She had heard these words before, but they felt different now, as if they carried more weight, more meaning. It had taken her time to accept her past, to understand her place in the world. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose. I've learned a lot from you, too, Kaya said, meeting her mother's gaze. From both of you. Hank watched the exchange in silence, his heart swelling with quiet pride. The two women before him were not the same people who had arrived at his ranch months ago. They had been broken then, but now they were healing. They were finding their way back to each other, and to themselves. Over the next few days, the work on the ranch began to take on a new energy. Kaya, Ayana, and Hank worked side by side, planting seeds in the garden, repairing the fences, and tending to the animals. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward something bigger. For the first time in a long while, there was laughter around the cabin. Laughter that came not from necessity, but from a shared sense of purpose. The land had become not just a place to survive, but a place to thrive. One afternoon, as they worked in the fields, Ayana turned to Hank with a thoughtful expression on her face. Hank, she began, I've been thinking, we need to find the others. We can't do this alone. The Apache people are scattered, but they are still out there. I can feel it. Hank wiped the sweat from his brow, considering her words. He had known this day would come, the day when Ayana would have to leave to search for the rest of her people. He understood that the call to find her tribe would never leave her, but he also knew how difficult the journey would be. The desert was unforgiving, and the Apache had been hunted, scattered, and forced into hiding. It would be dangerous. I'll go with you, Hank said quietly. If you need me, I'll help you find them. Ayana looked at him, her expression filled with both gratitude and sorrow. I cannot ask that of you. This is my journey, not yours. I know, Hank said, his voice steady. But you're not alone anymore, Ayana. We've come this far together. I won't let you go out there alone. Kaya, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. I want to help too, she said, her voice strong. I've learned enough to know that I can fight for what's mine. And my people, they are mine. I'll help you find them, Mother. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she was silent, overcome by the weight of her emotions. She had lost so much, but now she had found something even more important. A family, a home, and a future. You are both stronger than I ever could have imagined, Ayana said, her voice trembling. I've spent so many years thinking I had to do everything on my own, but now I see that we are stronger together. The three of them stood there side by side, the desert winds blowing softly around them. They were no longer just a cowboy and two lost Apache women. They were a family bound by their shared history, their struggles, and their dreams for the future. As the sun set over the land, Hank felt a deep sense of peace. The future was uncertain and the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. He was no longer just a solitary cowboy on a vast empty land. He was part of something bigger, a family that would stand together no matter the challenges they faced. And with that thought, Hank knew that their journey was just beginning. They had found each other and now they would find their place in the world, together,